Chicago winter 1929. The air is sharp, the streets slick with ice and blood. 7 men lie crumpled against a brick wall, their bodies riddled with bullets. The smell of gunpowder hangs heavy. The city will never forget this day, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. And at the center of it all, a man who claimed he was just a businessman. His name? Al Capone. But behind the tailored suits and diamond rings was a reign of terror that turned Chicago into a war zone. Stay with us, because by the end of this story, you'll see how one man's empire of booze, bullets, and bribery brought an entire city to its knees. And if you love true crime told raw and real, hit that subscribe button now, so you never miss the stories they tried to bury. To understand Al Capone, you have to understand the world that made him. The year is 1920. The United States has just passed the 18th Amendment, Prohibition. Alcohol is outlawed, but instead of sobering up the nation, it opens the floodgates for organized crime. Capone was born Alphonse Gabriel Capone in Brooklyn, New York, in 1899. The son of Italian immigrants, he grew up in a tough neighborhood where survival meant knowing the right people and sometimes doing the wrong things. By his teens, he was running with the 5 Points gang, learning the rules of the underworld from men who'd kill without hesitation. A knife fight in his youth left him with 3 deep scars on his face. Scars he hated, but the world would never forget. They called him Scarface. In 1919, Capone moved to Chicago at the invitation of Johnny Torrio, a seasoned mob boss. Torrio saw potential in the young Capone, and soon he was more than just muscle. He was the heir apparent. Chicago in the 1920s was a city divided. On one side, Capone's Chicago outfit, controlling bootlegging, gambling, and prostitution. On the other, the North Side Gang, led first by Dean O'Banion, then Jaime Weiss, and finally George Bugs Moran. The streets ran red as both sides fought for control of the city's most lucrative business, illegal liquor. Bombings, drive-by shootings, and assassinations became part of daily life. If you owned a bar and didn't buy from Capone, proceed. You risked waking up to find it reduced to rubble. In 1925, after Torrio was nearly killed in an ambush, he retired, handing the empire to Capone. At just 26 years old, Capone was now the most powerful gangster in America. But power came with enemies. One of the deadliest was Joe Aiello, a rival who tried repeatedly to poison Capone's food, offering thousands to anyone who could kill him. Each hitman Aiello sent ended up dead. February 14th, 1929. Capone is in Florida, far from the icy streets of Chicago. But his men are not. That morning, 4 gunmen, 2 dressed as police officers, enter a garage at 2122 North Clark Street, Moran's headquarters. They line 7 of Moran's men against a wall. Then, without warning, the room erupts in gunfire. Tommy guns, shotguns. When it's over, the men are unrecognizable. Moran himself escapes, but the message is clear. No one crosses Al Capone. The massacre shocks the nation. Photographs of the bodies hit newspapers coast to coast. Capone's image as a Robin Hood figure, the man who opened soup kitchens during the Depression, is shattered. The public demands justice. But Chicago's police are riddled with corruption. Local authorities can't touch Capone, so the federal government steps in. President Herbert Hoover orders every federal agency to focus on bringing Capone down. The Treasury Department, the Justice Department, and a small, incorruptible team of Prohibition agents, later nicknamed the Untouchables, begin building a case. They can't pin the murders on him, but they can prove something else, that Capone is living like a king without paying a dime in taxes. Capone's empire is built on loyalty and fear, but cracks begin to show. Some of his closest men turn informant. Ledgers are found. Witnesses testify about his lavish spending. In 1931, Capone is indicted on 22 counts of tax evasion. The trial is a spectacle. Capone arrives in custom suits, smiling for the cameras, confident he can bribe his way out. But Judge James Wilkerson has other plans. He swaks out the jury at the last minute to prevent tampering. The evidence is overwhelming. On October 17, 1931, the verdict comes in, guilty on 5 counts of tax evasion. Capone is sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, fined $50,000, and ordered to pay back taxes. For a man who once ruled Chicago, it's the ultimate humiliation. He serves time in Atlanta, then is transferred to Alcatraz, the Rock, where his health deteriorates from untreated syphilis. Capone is released in 1939, a shadow of his former self. He spends his final years in Florida, mentally and physically broken. On January 25, 1947, Al Capone dies of cardiac arrest after a stroke. He is 48 years old, but his legacy? It's carved into the history of organized crime. The Chicago mob wars changed the way America saw gangsters, not as folk heroes, but as ruthless criminals who could corrupt an entire city. Al Capone once said, "I am just a businessman giving the people what they want." But what he gave Chicago was fear, bloodshed, and a legacy of violence that still echoes through its streets. And maybe that's the real lesson here, that power built on fear will always crumble. But the stories, they never die. If you want more true crime stories told without the sugarcoating, subscribe now, because the next case might be even darker.